Thanks for joining us for a discussion about the thinning wall between church and state, especially in America's schools. Recent cases before the Supreme Court call into question what's left of that separation and how it's currently affecting schools and what could be coming next. I'm Jason Fields, Deputy Opinion Editor at Newsweek and host of the Angry Planet podcast. Joining me today are Kevin Bowling of the Secular Student Alliance and Salam Al-Mariyati, President of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Salam, could you start us off with how you see the current situation and how it's sort of slipped from what the ideal might be?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I think in general, what we're seeing is just outside the school system in public is a slippage towards religious nationalism. And I believe that America has been defined by secularism as being neutral on religion. And once a government or a political party or any powerful group for that matter endorses and advocates and imposes upon the rest of society a religious view on the rest, then that violates the definition of secularism. And in my opinion, religion actually flourishes the best in a secular society, not in a religious nationalistic society. When you have religious nationalism, then all religious minorities, and including religious groups that are part of that religion but do not adopt that particular ideology, suffer. And I know that because my family comes from the Middle East. And that is exactly what is happening in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, I wouldn't say that America is, close to the problems that we find in those Middle Eastern countries, but it doesn't take much when you slip to spiral down to a situation like that. And then obviously there you have the situation where government not only controls what's happening in schools, but they control what's happening in the mosques and houses of worship. They control what's happening in the media, and so on and so forth. So I'm afraid that once we adopt a religious nationalistic position here in America and have to follow that, that obviously affects the way our children are raised without the freedoms that we as parents have in terms of what we believe, aside from the science and the math and everything else. But when that encroaches upon them in their schools, then that's just another marker that we're going down that path where there is not that separation of church and state, that we all have to adopt a certain position. And if we don't, then we're considered to be dissidents at the very least. And sometimes, as Muslims, as we've seen so often, we become enemies of the state simply because of our religious views.
Kevin, what do you think about that? I mean, are you concerned about the same stuff?
Yeah, and it's great being on here with you, Jason and Salam. And I agree with what Salam is saying. I think if you look at the past decade, and you can go back even further, but I think really the sort of the marking of the more recent in the last decade, the last 4 years, the move and the openness to embrace Christian nationalism, and I know Salam was polite, I think, in saying religious nationalism, but in the United States, it really is, we're talking about Christian nationalism. And the outward appearance where we have elected politicians now openly, not even courting, but stating, I am a Christian nationalist, and we should be. And our acceptance of Christianity as a Christian nation and looking at putting Christian values in the place of our public sphere, our laws, our public policy is getting more and more dangerous. And I agree with Salam. If we look at a pluralistic United States where we value the freedom of and from religion since our inception as a country and repeated multiple times throughout our leaders, throughout our history, and has been backed by the Supreme Court previously, and I think we're in a I don't like, and I think where the Supreme Court is going now, and I think is very anti the foundation of our country. that doesn't support a pluralistic country. And that really doesn't support the freedom of religion, as I think we traditionally know it, and only codifies Christian nationalism, which, and when we start to, and I agree with Salam in that instance, it's a very slippery slope when we start to think of the theocracies in other countries that the United States has traditionally been pushing democracy and less theocracy. I think there are many people in politics right now, conservative, Republican, right wing, who are not that far from that and what they are preaching in politics.
Yeah, we're actually at a point where we're not, when we say Christian nationalism, we're talking about a very specific flavor of Christianity, even. We're not actually open to the idea of Catholicism. I mean, it's very, very focused. And I would say that that's even more dangerous. It leaves more and more people out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, religious nationalism is not religion as we know it. Religious nationalism is when a powerful group, an influential group, uses religion as a vehicle for power. And they blur the lines between religion and state. Islamic history, actually, classical Islamic jurisprudence has shown that it was always best when the scholars were separate from the political state, if you will. So you had the political entity, and then you had the religious entity that was separate, more like the independent judiciary in classical Islamic civilization. Later on is when that line was blurred and we see what we have today, whereas religion and state play either a duplicitous role of serving each other, but claiming to be independent, or a theocracy altogether. And so when we talk about Christian nationalism here, it is not Christianity. When religion becomes part of the power structure, it is not religion anymore. Jesus was never part of a power structure. Moses was never part of a power structure. And so when we see religion become part of the state, that's a violation of religion, in my opinion. It should always be the property of the people, theoretically. And so that is what we're seeing today, and therefore religious nationalism is not, in my opinion, founded even upon religious principles as we know or understand them in terms of the great religions that we have today.
And that's the result of hundreds, if not thousands of years of, well, if you want to call it progress, between when things were actually, I mean, the idea that kings could appoint bishops, I mean, it's been very, very confused over the years,
right.
But we've sort of reached a place where we thought things would be a little bit different. And that's actually brings me to the Supreme Court decisions that recently, that have really taken, I think, my understanding of how secularism worked in this country and sort of stood it on its head. So can we talk about Kennedy versus Bremerton? You guys ready for that?
Sure, let's go ahead.
Okay.
I'll let Kevin take the lead on that one, and then I'll comment.
Okay, great. Well, let me just say what the case was for those of you who were not familiar with it right off the bat. It's a decision by Neil Gorsuch that basically said that a public school football coach could say a prayer on the 50-yard line after a game. And Gorsuch said that, yes, in a public environment by a public official, or, I mean, I think actually teachers are officials in a sense, that, it's okay to bring religion right into it. So, yeah, I mean, Kevin, what do you see when you hear that?
Well, I think this particular case has been a sort of setup, a long-term play of getting cases into the Supreme Court, especially this Supreme Court, to tear down the wall, the separation of church and state, and make our country and our schools less pluralistic. And so I think when you look at the facts of Brennan, I think the Supreme Court was very was very loose with the facts and tried to make a case to prove a point in enshrining their religious beliefs or supporting supporting religion in the public square. Our country is from the First Amendment to Jefferson's Danbury Letter to the Tripoli Treaty, our history has said we have a separation of church and state, and this clearly breaks down the wall where you have a public employee at a public event, school event, reciting religion. And it was, this has been an ongoing thing. It wasn't a public, it was the entire football team inviting the other team out. And we know that students on football, students in the past have complained and felt compelled. And you have a person who's in a position of power and privilege in the school doing this. And so that really tears down the wall of separation from state and infects one religion into the public square. And I would say if that was a Muslim prayer that was taking place on the football field, I think there would have been a very different outcome by the Supreme Court. And again, this is favoring Christianity above other religions and non-religion in the public square. And I think it's important. Students have the right to pray at school. That has been a freedom that has been expressed. Student-led prayer, students praying, they can pray at any time they want in school. So it is when a public employee and using a public facility with public funds, it's where it changes that definition. And really the Lemon test, which has been a previous Supreme Court case, which has been the basis for determining this, I mean, it broke all three principles, really, of the case.
Blum, what's your take on it?
Well, it's interesting. There was an accusation that Muslims are trying to impose Sharia in America, that we're trying to, do this stealth jihad, as they called it, of making America into an Islamic state, which was a joke because they didn't know what Sharia means. Sharia just means your path to God, and it's the personal path to God. But in any case, this is actually, a case where it is, we are imposing religion, a religious view on students. And so I agree with Kevin that when you're a public official, you cannot endorse any religion whatsoever. If the people want to come in and do a prayer in City Hall and do a prayer in the Congress and celebrate Christmas and Ramadan and Hanukkah and Yom Kippur and all the great religious holidays, it has to be initiated and sponsored by the people. And that's where I feel religion should always be the property of the people and never endorsed or advocated or sponsored by the government.
And one thing that's been said is the amount of pressure that's on someone to participate. It's easy for me to think of myself as the one football player who doesn't want to go into the 50-yard line and say this prayer. How brave am I? And how am I going to be treated when I get back to the sidelines?
Yeah.
Is that part of the issue, Kevin, that you've been talking about?
I think it's definitely part of the issue. And there are students and families who had made complaints before about the prayers and feeling that if they didn't participate, and by someone who held power over, a coach decides who plays, and their participation in both on and off the field. If they don't participate in this, what are going to be the ramifications? And again, this is based on someone who's hired a public employee with his own personal religious views and subjecting those on students. And we're starting, I think this was an entry-level court case to sort of open the door into many other things that really the religious right want to continue to push within our general society, but really within schools and making sure that they control youth and indoctrinate youth at a very early age.
Well, that certainly sounds like an interesting aim, and that that leads me to the next question I had, which is, what's the end result here? What would it look like if this wall continues to be eaten away, and if I mean, and what are do you see as some of the implications of this decision? I mean, what are we going to see next? If it's not a prayer on the 50-yard line, what is it?
Well, and I think when we start to look at what are some of the playbook, and there was Project Blitz, which was fairly well publicized on the internet, and really that's sort of taking on the second iteration now, where it's really a strategy and a plot to continue to slowly normalize and push Christianity into the public square. And it's fine to have religion of any sort in our, or not, in our country. But again, it's, I agree with Islam, by the people. And so what we're looking at, and I think with when Roe was overturned, with a Supreme Court justice sort of in his statement, invite, let's look at same-sex marriage, let's look at contraceptive and healthcare. So opening that door, almost an invitation, and let's bring some other cases. And we know that the religious right now is really pushing, let's bring cases, and almost, putting laws in, hoping that they'll go to the Supreme Court. We know from some of their playbook in schools, so that they're looking at, 10 Commandments displays in public buildings and at schools, and trying to, indoctrinate to that. Call to prayer for America Day, and it's not prayer in general, it's Christian prayer. I mean, I think we have to recognize that. But student prayer certification, where, enshrining that students have the right to pray at campus, at a school or on a campus, which they already do. Looking at preserving religious freedom in school. And it's not religious freedom that they're using that word, but what they really mean is, and what we call it, is the license to discriminate. So whereas a student organization, or as a student, I can not only discriminate against other religions, LGBT students, non-religious students, but I also get student or public funds to do that. So unfortunately, you can discriminate, and that's fine, but you can't get public funds for that. I don't think either one of them is good, but definitely not the public funds part. We're looking at, rules pushing on libraries and what they can and can't have in libraries, holding librarians accountable with even lawsuits and fines. We're looking at sex education and parental consent into that, and free speech acts, which again it sounds like one of our ideals. Freedom of religion and free speech. The reality is it's the right for Christian students to be able to discriminate and receive public funds, which goes against our principles, is not an American value, and is against the pluralist society that we value.
Well, so, Salam, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But what are you thinking ahead? And is there any particular aspect of this decision that troubles you?
Well, I mean, first of all, if I could just zoom out a little bit. I mean,
Oh, sure, please.
yeah, I think that our Constitution and the framers of the Constitution, the architects of this great democracy, put into place a system where we can mitigate these problems. We can make sure that there is that separation of church and state, that it continues. So, and we've seen, for example, and I'll take it to another issue of, overturning Roe v. Wade. I believe that there was a massive effort by a number of groups who opposed the overturning of Roe v. Wade to get the vote out. And so the people got their voices heard in this election. And you see the results that, and we'll just put it in terms of the category of pro-Trump people did not win, as was expected, and so there's a mechanism that has been built in to ensure that there is a separation of church and state. Maybe we are slipping, but we have the opportunity to bring it back as a people. So I have confidence in that. Number two, I just want to make it clear that, since I'm part of a religious organization and I serve, in capacity as an advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, for example, we have Muslims who are elected to public office, and there are Jews and Christians. There are people who are religiously devout. Again, there's nothing wrong with religious groups working to get represented in our government, in our system. The only point is they cannot impose their religious views when it comes to legislation, when it comes to appropriation of funds, and so on and so forth, as Kevin articulated. I'm not for removing religion out of society. I am for making sure that religion is, as I said, the property of the people, and that government does not endorse or sponsor any particular religious activity. But of course, in our founding documents, you have the idea of that we're serving God, and that we are a people of many religious beliefs, and including those who do not believe in God, that they are part of our society, and we need to make sure that their rights are guaranteed in our system of governance and our decision making. So I have confidence that we're going to get out of this in the positive and retain that separation of church and state. There was a question about Prophet Muhammad, because he was an elected leader. He was a head of state. And we won't have time, but I think this is where we as a people, and Muslims in particular, need to read what he developed in his constitution. In his constitution, it said that it was a secular document. It didn't say it was a secular document, but it was a secular document. In other words, it was not a religious document. The Constitution did not say we're going to have 5 prayers a day, and we're going to fast in Ramadan, and we're going to have all these things, and prayer in schools, and prayer in whatever they had. It was, no, here's a Jewish tribe. The Jewish tribe has its rights, and they are part of our community now. They have their religion and their laws, and therefore let them apply their laws to their and their customs. Here's another tribe, and they have their laws and their ways, and they are allowed to practice the way that their custom dictates. So to me, that was a model of pluralism. And that is what we need today. We need to maintain pluralism in our society and tell government not to encroach on our views as religious people, and to allow pluralism to thrive, and not tell us that we have to be one way in terms of religion.
Yeah, personally, I would argue that the founding fathers, I mean, it's hard to, unfortunately, the gender issues, that's something else, but
right.
It's hard to argue that they weren't mostly, if not almost completely, talking about religion as a force and in something that's important, as opposed to atheism, for example. I mean, you might have had, there's the argument about Thomas Jefferson, and he was the one who really wanted to work towards church and state, but it's not necessarily about, it's about allowing minority religions to actually participate and to survive, literally survive within this country. I think is just is an interesting part of it, and it's something that we're dealing with now, in the sense of there's a lot of anti-Semitic violence, anti-Muslim violence, which is on the rise, and I think as you have a breakdown of church and state, that's I don't know if it's inevitable, but it seems like a consequence.
Well, I mean, as the CIA and FBI said, right now, the major national security threat to our society is coming from, they won't say these are Christian nationalists, but is the white militia, which has a strong underpinning, obviously, of Christian nationalism, and that is to us, that should be the another clarion call, that when you mix religion with power like this, it becomes violent. It becomes violent, as you said, to a number of Jewish temples and synagogues have been attacked. Black churches have been attacked. It goes on, and so that in and of itself should raise the alarm bells about where we're going with all this.
Kevin, do you have any thoughts about this directly?
I completely agree. I do think there and you sort of mentioned we need to make sure we're protecting minority religions, and I completely agree with that. And I think the focus of what is taking place now in the United States is really to promote Christianity and Christian nationalism within politics. I mean, Pew released a survey, I think, a couple of weeks ago, whereas 45% of the United States thinks that the United States is a Christian nation. So the ongoing story of we're a Christian nation, we're a Christian nation, we're a Christian nation, and Christian values should be dictated in our policies and in our laws is taking hold. And I am happy to hear, and I'm hopeful with Salam that this is getting better. And I do think people are starting to see. Although I do think the reality is we are continuing to go more towards the theocracy aspect rather than the democracy pluralistic aspect, and we're becoming more and more divided. And I think religious conservatives and Christian nationalists are looking for more and more ways to make sure that we are diverting more public funds into religious avenues. And the Supreme Court case after disasters and rebuilding churches, school vouchers, all of those things are designed for more and more. It's public funds, it's the government supporting and endorsing religion. And there's a reality, it's one religion over the others and over a secular society.
Well, thank you for a wonderful segue to the next Supreme Court case that we wanted to talk about, which is Carson versus Macon. That's a case in which basically a religious school is getting funding from the government and is being forced to the government is being forced to actually pay for the operation of a religious school. Is that new, Kevin? Or, I mean, is that or something that's sort of been building?
I would say I don't know the complete history of the government supporting private religious schools. And in some instances, with religious colleges, there's always some federal money that take place, but there's conditions to those. So if we're looking at, against discrimination and for the betterment of the people, which I think, anyone, I think all of us should, as a taxpayers, I don't have kids in school. I am more than happy to pay to support our public schools. There's an inherent value in our society with that. But there has been a definite move to transition and push for school vouchers. And it's under the seeming of your freedom of speech and to choose the school of your choice, which sound great. The reality is it's a way to funnel public funds to religious schools. And again, in this case, almost solely to Christian schools. And the reality is why it sounds great. The reality is it hurts religion, the freedom of religion, and it really has the potential to hurt. It does hurt students as well in the process. So the research showed that students do academically less well in the voucher program. And I think to Salam was talking a little bit about earlier, is it starts then to encroach on the government now supporting, in this case, mostly one religion. So now I think our society values that we don't want government entangled in religion. And so while right now there's no accountability almost, there's, and those schools don't have to meet minimum criteria or teaching standards or topics that we're teaching. If the government starts to impose those, now we're getting into the government getting involved in religious teaching, which is not where we want to be, much less the effect that this has shown actually to hurt students, not help students.
And it's actually double sort of tax break for these schools in that they're not charged taxes for any of their operations anyway, which is a special exemption for religious organizations, which not really the point here, but just something that sticks in my mind.
And it takes money from public schools. So, I mean, I think America was founded on quality public education from K through higher education. And we were a model for many other countries in our public education. But right now it's stealing money from public schools and oftentimes students who can least afford, or or who really need those services, and putting it into places where it's it's typically very white and wealthy to start with, but we're robbing from public schools to give and pay for religious education.
I think that's probably one of the most important points. And, we just had a proposition here in California or I think LA City, to support music and art in our schools. And it's just mind-boggling that we have now the haves and the have-nots, where there are schools that do not have that opportunity as part of learning. Of course they should have that. And so to take money and to give it to the schools that already have more money and take it away from public education, I think that is the line that we cannot cross as a society, because then we are basically allowing these public schools to deteriorate even further, and poor neighborhoods will have worse schools, and worse schools will have students that are not capable to compete for the better colleges, and that cycle of poverty will continue. So that, if you're a religious person, that should be your number one concern, is to deal with poverty. And so to hoard this money, for religious schools, I think that's a violation of our religion in and of itself. On the other issue, I think, and I don't know if you're going to cover this, Jason, but there are several religious organizations that receive public funding that actually do good work for society, like Catholic Charities, like a number of these senior homes and community centers, and religious groups have been known to organize these things. That's actually an area where I think we need to support or continue, as long as there's not that, if you will, that along with the service, you have to go and do a prayer according to that religion, or accept this figure as your savior, and so on and so forth. So as long as that is clear, then I think groups like Catholic Charities and a number of other groups that have done good work in our society should continue to be supported, because they are doing good work. A lot of the refugee assistance comes from religious organizations as well. So we need that cooperation between government and religious groups to do this good work. But again, that as long as there's not that mixture of religious ideology with the social services that is being delivered.
So that actually, just one quick thing. Now, some of the cases that have been brought are not about the people receiving the charity being forced to take up a particular religious point of view or action, but the people who work at the charities. For example, doctors, nurses, they have to, they will not provide abortions. They have to, obey certain religious. I mean, is that something that you would be equally concerned about, not just how it faces the public?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't thought about that in terms of how to mitigate that problem. But I agree that if a group is receiving public funding, then they have to be open to allow others to, as long as they're qualified in terms of the service, that religious ideology is not part of the qualifications for that job. Mm-hmm. If they want public funding. If they want to do it on their own, then absolutely. Like, if a Muslim conservative, let's say they are very conservative, yeah, of course they have the right to have employees and staffing and work according to their religious beliefs. But once they take that public funding, then no, then that, I think, it requires them to be more open to bringing people in. Now, part of this also, it reminds me of what happened after 9/11, when the government started getting into the business of Islamic theology and started telling us who the good Muslims are and who the bad Muslims are. Even though Saudi Arabia, is the one that really had more people involved in 9/11 than anyone else, they were still the good Muslims. Be like that. and everywhere else was, well, those are bad Muslims. And so to me, that this strikes home when the government gets into the business of telling us what's the good theology and what's the bad theology.
So Kevin, you look like you want to say something.
Well, so yeah, I think when we start looking at whether it's schools or charities doing good, and I think there are lots of religious charities who do good, but I think in schools, and again there are not those requirements and minimum standards. So public religious schools don't have to abide by the Civil Rights Act, don't have to abide by Title IX, don't have to abide by Americans with Disabilities Act, are allowed to discriminate against LGBT students and faculty. So the level of discrimination that is easily played in based on religious beliefs is concerning. And when we start to look at Catholic charities, when we look at adoption, when we look at refugees, and we're not going to take LGBT refugees, the problematic nature of, and to me, the religion, your religious beliefs and religious people should be the ones who are inclusive and pluralistic and bringing people in. But yet that is often, and this is not a comment, Salam is on here, this is not a comment towards Salam whatsoever. I'm just talking generally. But this is when it's often used as an arm to discriminate against others. And so we start to choose religiously based on our religious values, which I think should be inclusive, which oftentimes are not, on who we get then to discriminate against. So if they're taking public funds and now don't have to abide by all these things that we value in a pluralistic society, to discriminate against other people is where I really start to have, obviously, the issue with that. And I think there's a different frame in the United States. We've decided that we need nonprofits and religious charities and those things to take care of basic human rights and dignity. And I think it's a mindset that and a philosophy that we've sort of adopted. I would love it to where we just believe that as human beings and the value of humanity, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to live a quality life. And that should just be there. It should be a human right in the United States. And we shouldn't have to rely on charity to make that happen. It's just a core basic value.
Wow, is that hard to argue with? Human decency. Maybe we should try it out. So, as we sort of draw to a close, Salam, what do you see that in this discussion we've really missed? What's important that we haven't covered?
No, I think we've covered a lot. And actually, it has gotten me to think more about the issues that you and Kevin have brought up, because, I come from a religious community, and we're actually, to be quite frank, struggling with some of these issues of separation of church and state. Do we support the religious conservatives because a lot of members of our community, align with those values? But in doing so, do we forget about, hey, we're living in a democracy, in a pluralistic society that has this separation of church and state for our benefit, and when we violate that, or when we blur the line, that ends up hurting us in the long run? Do we support people that really believe in this separation of church and state, and are very much strict about that, if you will? I believe that that's where we need to be in general. But there are so many examples where, as we talked about, religious schools and religion and social services and religious and humanitarian aid, and where is that discrimination taking place? That deserves a lot of thinking and conversation in our community. As I said before, I come, my family comes from the Middle East. We see where religion has been usurped by powerful groups. I don't want that to happen here in America. And I would say, when it comes to current leaders of quote unquote Islamic movements and people that want to have an Islamic state, I would say all of them are disqualified because they do not understand the separation of religion and state. Because they tend to just want to have one ideological view represented in their state. And to me, that's a violation of our religion that says there's no compulsion in matters of faith. That's in chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran. So if they can't do that and they create morality police to go and control women, to me, that's not Islam. And so we have a long ways to go to think through these issues. So there's a lot that we haven't covered, of course, but you have, Jason and Kevin, you have given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate that. And I hope we continue this conversation moving forward.
And, since we're playing Crossfire, Kevin, any thoughts from you?
No, I agree with what Salam said there a lot. And I think the concern for us really is, and it's the political nature that now has codified Christian nationalism in the United States. And as Salam sort of mentioned, I do think there are some points where we are seeing people voting, the states voting, and making sure that we're counteracting that. The reality is the political forces that are moving in our country, again, openly embracing and stating that they're Christian nationalist, and the historic danger with discrimination and white supremacy and all those things that come in with that. And I appreciate Salam doing this session with us, because we find our students on campuses often are allied with Muslim students, LGBT students, and other minority religions, because the pervasiveness of Christian nationalism that they're seeing and how that's taking over, and the favoritism towards one religion, when our society, for its, in its founding and history, has been about not endorsing any particular religion, but allowing people to be religious or not religious. And I think we are unfortunately pushing a precipice where we're moving much more towards a theocracy than we are into a democracy. So I'm hopeful with what Salam says in his viewpoint. I'm waiting to see it at the national level, and the tide is not going, I think, in the direction that we'd like to see it. Hopefully this current vote that just happened is a window into something slightly different.
All right. Well, I just want to thank both of you for coming here and talking about these issues that they're not simple. And to a certain extent, people are going to come up with their own answers, but hopefully we've provided more information to help people think it through. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Salam. Appreciate being here with you today.
Appreciate it. I learned a lot myself, so I feel like I have to pay you tuition now.
Well, I think it's as Jason said, it's an ongoing conversation, and I think the more we have it and the more we recognize it, the better we all become about it. And how we're going to move forward on that also makes a very stark difference.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Appreciate it.